On a night of luxury, power, and impeccable appearances, a young woman accustomed to passing unnoticed makes a mistake as simple as it is devastating by occupying a seat that should never have been hers. What seemed to be just another moment of humiliation amidst the elite is transformed when the most feared and admired man in that hall takes an action that no one would dare predict. Between sharp glances, cruel rumors, and a connection impossible to ignore, she will be dragged into the center of a world that always made her believe she did not belong to it. But when the truth finally comes to light, everyone will discover that sometimes the greatest mistake of a night can be exactly what changes a life forever. Before diving into this intense, surprising story full of twists and turns, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more emotional reports like this one. The hall of the Gran Palacio Ibirapuera had that type of deafening silence that only exists when everything around is too expensive to make noise. The crystal glasses captured the light from the chandeliers and returned golden reflections on the walls lined with Portuguese marble. The floral arrangements, white orchids arranged on stems of almost a meter, looked like sculptures and not flowers, too beautiful to be touched. It was the Maison Velarde annual gala, the most anticipated event on Brazil's fashion calendar, and every detail of that space communicated a silent but absolutely clear message. This world was not made for everyone. Camila Fonseca arrived at 6 in the evening, 1 hour before the guests. She carried a clipboard, a pen that had already been failing since the morning, and a grey blazer she had borrowed from her roommate the day before. The blazer was 2 sizes larger than hers, and she knew it. She folded the sleeves discreetly as she walked to the registration table, where she was supposed to help organize the badges in alphabetical order and confirm the names on the list. It was her function. Simple, invisible, necessary in the way that necessary things usually are, without glamour and without recognition. Camila was 26 years old and had been for 3 months in the internship at the partner agency of Maison Velarde, a corporate events company that provided services for luxury brands. She had reached that internship after years working in jobs that had nothing to do with what she studied, which was communication design. Pharmacy attendant, receptionist in a dental office, supermarket cashier on weekends. College had been a real achievement, paid for with a partial scholarship and with the money left over after rent and the electricity bill. When she finally got the internship, she knew she was on a margin of the world she wanted to inhabit, but still far from the center. That night, the coordinator responsible for registration, a woman with tied-back hair and long strides named Deborah, called her aside as soon as she arrived. There was a problem with the badge printing system at the last minute, and the entire support team would need to concentrate at the hall entrance to resolve it. Camila was left out because the badges she was organizing were those on the VIP list, already printed and separated. But when she returned to the registration table with the clipboard under her arm, she noticed that the table had been dismantled. The badges had been taken. Someone had assumed the function without warning. She stood still in the access corridor to the hall for a few moments, not knowing exactly what to do. Call Deborah. Send a message. Look for another workstation? No one had given her instructions for this eventuality. She was an intern, and interns, she had discovered over the months, were trained to solve problems when they existed and to disappear when the situation became confusing. The hall began to fill slowly. The first guests arrived in small groups, the women with dresses that were worth more than 6 months of Camila's salary, the men with impeccable suits, and that specific posture of someone who never needed to hunch their shoulders to fit anywhere. Conversations in low voices, controlled laughter, air kisses that touched no one's cheek. Camila observed all this while trying to become part of the wall. It was then that she saw the table. It was in a corner slightly away from the center of the hall, separated from the others by a discreet partition of ornamental plants. It had 6 chairs, an immaculate white tablecloth, and an arrangement of orchids smaller than the others, as if the space were reserved for something more intimate. There was a sign on the table, but it was turned face down, leaning sideways against the central vase, as if someone had knocked it over without noticing. The chairs were all empty. Camila was not planning to sit down. She just wanted a place to rest the clipboard and check if there was any message from Deborah on her cell phone. But when she got close to the table and looked around, She found that the hall was getting increasingly full, that everyone around seemed to have some purpose except her, and that empty chair, in that discreet corner, seemed to be the only thing in that hall that was not judging anyone. She sat. It was perhaps 10 minutes. She checked her cell phone. There was no response from Deborah. She observed the movement of the hall without participating in it, and tried to mentally organize what she would do when the coordinator reappeared. The noise of the conversations increased gradually. The ambient music rose a tone, and Camilla began to relax slightly, warmed by the sensation of anonymity that remote corner provided. That was when she felt it. It was not a loud noise. It was not a voice that shouted or a gesture that drew attention. It was just a presence, the type of presence that some people carry with them, as if the space around them reorganized itself to receive them. Camilla raised her eyes from the cell phone screen and saw him. He was a little over 40 years old, brown hair slightly graying at the sides, dark suit without a tie with the first button of the shirt open. He was not the tallest man in the hall, but there was something in the way he moved that made height irrelevant. He walked toward the table without haste, with that quiet security of someone who never needed to announce his arrival anywhere. Two advisors walked 2 steps behind, talking in low voices to each other. He was not talking to anyone. He was looking directly at her. Camilla felt her stomach drop. He stopped at a polite distance from the table and looked at the sign that was turned sideways over the central arrangement. Then he looked at her again, and for the first time she noticed that his eyes were a very dark brown, almost black, and that he was not angry. He was with something harder to name. "You are sitting in my place," he said, with a voice that did not need volume to fill the space. Camilla stood up so fast she almost knocked over the chair. The clipboard hit the table, made a dry noise that seemed to echo through the entire hall, and she felt the heat rise through her face at a speed she could not control. Around, some nearby guests had turned discreetly to observe. She opened her mouth to apologize, but the words came out in pieces, scrambled, insufficient. "I didn't see the sign. It was turned over. I didn't know it was reserved. I'm so sorry. I'm leaving now. Really sorry. It was by accident." She grabbed the clipboard and took a step to the side, ready to leave there as fast as her legs could carry her, without it looking like a flight. But then something happened that she did not expect. His voice said, "Stop." It was not an aggressive order. It was a calm, direct instruction, the kind that does not admit discussion, not because of the authority of the one who pronounces it, but because of the clarity with which it is said. Camilla stopped. She turned slowly, not being sure of what she would find. He had pulled the chair next to the one she had occupied. He sat in it, with the naturalness of someone who decides where they want to be, without needing to explain to anyone. Then he tilted his head slightly to the side and said, with something that was not quite a smile but was also not indifference, "Sit down." Around, the silence among the nearby guests was of a different type now. It was no longer the elegant silence of the beginning of the night. It was the silence of someone who just saw something they did not expect and is still processing what that means. Camilla looked at the chair, looked at him, and then looked at the hall around as if she were looking for someone who could confirm that was really happening. No one confirmed anything. So she sat. The first seconds were the strangest of Camila Fonseca's life. She was sitting next to the CEO of Maison Velarde at an event she had entered as a logistical support intern, wearing a borrowed blazer that was not the right size, with a clipboard on her lap and a cell phone with a cracked screen in her hand. Around, people who were magazine covers observed her sideways with that type of controlled curiosity that the rich cultivate so as not to seem curious. And he, Alessandro Velarde, president of the most influential business group in Brazilian fashion, was sitting next to her as if that were the most natural thing in the world. Camilla did not know where to put her hands. Alessandro called one of the waiters with a minimal, almost imperceptible gesture, and 2 minutes later there was a glass of sparkling water and one of champagne in front of each of them. He took the water. He pushed the champagne toward Camilla without saying anything. She looked at the glass, looked at him, and then took the glass with an exaggerated delicacy, as if she were afraid that the crystal would decide to explode at that exact moment to complete her humiliation. "You work at the events agency," he said. It was not a question. Camilla nodded. Intern. I was at registration, but the system failed, and I was left without a function. I wasn't trying to... the sign was turned over, and I really didn't know it was your table. I know, he said. There was a pause. She expected him to continue, but he did not. He just looked at the center of the hall with an expression that was difficult to interpret. It was not discontent. It seemed like something closer to tiredness, the type of tiredness that has nothing to do with hours of sleep. Is it what you expected? He asked suddenly, without taking his eyes off the hall. Camilla frowned slightly. What do you mean? The event. He made a vague gesture with his hand encompassing the entire hall. Is it what you imagined when you accepted to work with luxury brands? She remained in silence for a moment. The honest answer was there on the tip of her tongue, but there were at least 4 very practical reasons not to say it. He was the CEO of the company that indirectly funded her internship. Anything she said could be used as a pretext to terminate her contract. She was at a high-level event, surrounded by influential people, and the last thing she needed was to create a scandal with an uncalled-for criticism. Besides, who was she to have an opinion about all that? But then she looked at him, and she noticed that he was not asking a protocol question. He was not testing her corporate loyalty, nor trying to extract a well-packaged compliment. There was something genuine in that look, a kind of tiredness from that same type of response that he probably received dozens of times a night, polished, calculated responses, wrapped in strategic admiration. It is very beautiful, she said carefully, and then, before she could stop herself, but it is cold. He turned to her. It was the first time he looked at her directly since he had sat down. Cold how? Camilla took a deep breath. Like a shop window. You look and you know it's beautiful, but you also know it wasn't made for you to touch. There is something in the aesthetic choices of tonight, in the color palette, in the arrangements, in the way the spaces were organized, that communicates exclusion even before communicating elegance. She stopped. Sorry. That was inappropriate. Continue, he said. She blinked. What? Continue what you were saying. There was something in his tone that was not a command. It was a genuine request, the type that rarely appears in the voice of people accustomed to being obeyed. Camilla looked at the hall again and let her gaze travel over the details she had observed since she arrived, the rigidity of the arrangements, the coldness of the overly white lighting, the absence of any element that was not perfect. Too perfect. The new visual identity of Maison Velarde, she said slowly. The new logo that was presented last week. It is very sophisticated, but it lost something. It seems like someone removed the heart and left only the frame. The silence that followed was different from all the other silences of that night. Alessandro Velarde remained completely still for a few seconds. His eyes, which had been turned toward the hall, landed on some undefined point between the table and the horizon, as if he were looking at something that only he could see. The old identity was created by my brother, he said in a low voice. He developed it over 2 years. It was in every detail of the company. When we needed to reposition the brand in the international market, the consultancy we hired recommended modernizing. They said the old logo was nostalgic. That nostalgia doesn't sell to the audience we want to reach. Camilla said nothing. There was something in those words that asked for silence before any response. I approved the change without thinking twice, he continued. I was too busy with the expansion to Europe. I signed the document in a meeting interval, without even opening the proposal file. He stopped. I only realized what I had done when I saw the new logo stamped on the facade of our flagship on Oscar Freire. I stood on the sidewalk for about 10 minutes looking at it. And you thought, Camilla said carefully, that you had exchanged something real for something merely correct. He looked at her again, this time with a different, more direct attention, as if he were trying to understand where that sentence had come from. What is your name? Camilla. Camilla Fonseca. Camilla. He repeated the name like someone checking if it fits in the space there is. Did you study design? Visual communication, still finishing graduate school? Where did you work before the agency? She hesitated only for an instant. Pharmacy, dental office, supermarket. Internship at a printing shop for 6 months before this one. She looked at him head-on as she said that, as if she were testing if he would look away. He did not look away. "And what brought you to fashion?" "The possibility that design can change how people see themselves," she said. "When a brand gets it right, it doesn't sell clothes. It gives someone back the permission to exist in a space that before seemed forbidden." Alessandro remained in silence for a longer moment this time. Around them, the hall continued its ritual of calculated elegance, conversations about contracts, about seasons, about who had debuted in which show in Milan. But in that corner, there was a conversation of another type entirely, the type that doesn't fit in press releases or in gala opening speeches. "You just described what my company was during the first 10 years, he said, "and what it ceased to be in the last 3. Before either of them could continue, an advisor approached from the side and leaned in slightly to speak into Alessandro's ear. It was time for the opening speech. The CEO nodded, pushed back his chair, and stood up. But before turning toward the center of the hall, he looked at Camilla one last time. "Don't go away," he said. And he went. Leaving Camilla sitting at that reserved table, with a glass of champagne she still had not touched, and a strange sensation in her chest that she still did not know how to name, but which had the exact shape of something that was about to change. Alessandro Velardi's speech lasted exactly 11 minutes. Camilla watched him from afar, from the reserved table she still occupied, because he had asked her to stay, and because she had nowhere to go anyway. He spoke well, with a security that did not depend on wide gestures or dramatic pauses, only on the certainty of someone who knows that what they are saying matters. The hall listened to him in respectful silence, that type of silence that is half admiration and half calculation about what would be possible to obtain from that admiration. Camilla did not hear half of the content. She was busy processing the previous 10 minutes. There was something very strange happening, and she knew it with the clarity that only appears when the mind stops trying to find an elegant explanation and accepts the obvious. She had told the CEO of one of the largest fashion companies in Brazil that his event was cold and that the new logo had lost its soul, and he had asked her to stay. He had not called security. He had not signaled to some advisor that she be gently removed from the premises. He had asked her to stay. That was the part that did not fit in any reasoning scheme she knew. When the speech ended and the applause rose through the hall, Camilla noticed that she was not the only one who had observed the scene at the reserved table. A few meters away, near a group of executives from partner brands, a woman looked at her with an attention that had nothing casual about it. She was in her early 40s, dark brown hair tied in an impeccable bun, a moss-green dress that matched that type of posture that is only acquired after years of practicing the art of occupying spaces without looking like one is trying. It was Renata Voss, director of expansion for Maison Velardi, the type of name that appeared in all the social columns, always accompanied by some superlative. Camilla did not know who she was at that moment, but she felt the look. Alessandro returned to the table shortly after, accompanied by 2 directors who were clearly in expectation of a conversation about business. He received them with courtesy, answered 2 quick questions, and then, with a disconcerting naturalness, directed his attention back to Camilla, as if that were the most urgent subject of the night. "The directors will want 10 more minutes of yours later," said one of the advisors. "They will have them," said Alessandro without looking at the advisor. Then to Camilla, "Will you have dinner?" She looked at him. "Here?" "Here. I am an intern from the partner agency. I wasn't invited to the dinner. You are being now." It was the second time that night that he left her without an immediate response. Camilla felt that there was a choice to be made, and that this choice had very little to do with food and much to do with who she would be when she left that hall. She could stand up, apologize politely, and go look for Deborah to ask if there was anything else to do, or she could stay. She could let happen what was happening without understanding yet what it was. She stayed. The dinner was served on plates that looked like contemporary art, tiny portions of things whose names she did not recognize, accompanied by sauces that the sommelier described with a seriousness she found slightly comical. Alessandro ate little, spoke more than she expected, and asked questions that no man in that position had asked her before. what she thought of certain recent brand campaigns, which visual decisions seemed mistaken to her, where she saw an opportunity that competitors had not yet explored. She answered with honesty, because she had already crossed the protocol line back there, when she said the event was cold, and there was no reason to retreat now. She said that the last campaign used technically perfect but emotionally absent models. She said that there was a growing trend of consumers who wanted to see imperfection, not as a defect, but as proof that there was a human being on the other side of those clothes. She said that the visual identity his brother had created had that, the feeling that someone had truly put their hand there. Alessandro listened to all this with total attention. He did not interrupt. He did not automatically agree. He asked follow-up questions that showed he had processed what she said before responding. It was during this stretch of the conversation that Renata Voss approached the table for the first time. She arrived with a smile that was absolutely perfect, the type that one learns to construct over years of events like that. She greeted Alessandro with the familiarity of someone who has worked with someone for a long time, and then turned the smile toward Camilla, with a lightness that had a thread of tension running through the middle. "How nice that you are integrating so well into the event," she said, in a tone that could be read as kindness, but had another layer underneath, thinner and sharper. "Camila Fonseca," said Alessandro, with a brevity that was not discourtesy, but was definitely a limit. "Works at the events agency, has a quite interesting perspective on brand communication." Renata nodded with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "How great." She looked at Camilla a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "I hope you are enjoying the night." Then she walked away with the same composure with which she had arrived. Camilla watched this in silence. There was something in that briefest encounter that she could not completely name, but which left an uncomfortable residue in the air of the table. Alessandro did not comment. He continued the conversation from where they had stopped, as if the interruption had lasted less than a second. But Camilla had noticed. The night continued. More guests approached Alessandro's table, and she stayed beside him, discreet, listening to conversations about international contracts, expansion into the Asian market, names of stylists she knew from most influential lists and who were now there in flesh and blood, gesturing with glasses in hand. At several moments, Alessandro included her in the conversation with a naturalness that disconcerted the people around, who clearly did not know what to do with that presence. Near 10 at night, when the event was already in the phase of cocktails and gradual goodbyes, Deborah finally reappeared beside Camilla with an expression that was a mixture of relief and perplexity. "Fonseca, are you okay?" "I am," said Camilla. Deborah looked at the table, looked at Alessandro, who was a few meters away talking to a group of directors, and then looked again at Camilla with an expression that clearly said there was a conversation to be had, but that was not the moment or the place. "Call me tomorrow," said Deborah in a low voice, and she left before either of them said anything else. Before leaving, Alessandro approached Camilla for the last time that night. There was an advisor beside him with a tablet in hand and the countenance of a person who had an entire agenda waiting to be fulfilled. Alessandro ignored the tablet. "Will you be at the agency tomorrow?" he asked. "Yes," said Camilla. He nodded once, like someone mentally noting information. Then he said, almost as a compliment to a reasoning he had initiated internally, "You have a way of seeing that I don't find in the people who are paid to have that way of seeing. That is rare." And then he went away, leaving Camilla standing in the middle of a hall that was beginning to empty, with the feeling that something had been planted that night, although she still did not know for sure what it was, nor if it would be a flower or a thorn. On the other side of the hall, Renata Voss watched her leave with an expression she would not have shown if she knew there was someone paying attention. The following morning, São Paulo woke up grey. It was the type of sky the city uses when it wants to remind you that it is not there to please anyone. Camilla went to work by subway, as always, with the earphone in only one side and her bag on her lap because of the full carriage. She had slept poorly. Not from excess of excitement, but from excess of thought. She kept replaying the entire night in separate parts, trying to understand what had really happened and what had been a product of the unusual environment, the champagne she had barely touched, and the strangeness of having spent hours at a table reserved for the CEO of a company she had nothing to do with. The conclusion she reached at the point between Consolação and Paulista stations was that there was probably nothing to conclude. It had been an out-of-the-ordinary night. People like Alessandro Velardi were unpredictable by whim, not by feeling. He had found a new interlocutor on a night when all the other interlocutors were the usual ones, had enjoyed the novelty, and the next morning was back to his agenda of directors, contracts, and international expansions. Nothing of what had been said at that table would need to have consequences in the real world. That conclusion lasted until 10:20 in the morning, when Deborah called her for a conversation in the hallway. "Maison Velardi contacted the agency early today," said Deborah in a low voice, with that tone of someone who is passing on information but has not yet decided if it is good or bad. Dr. Alessandro's advisor requested the direct contact of an intern named Camila Fonseca. She paused. "Do you have any idea what that means?" Camila had several ideas, none that she thought wise to share in that hallway. "He asked me some questions at the event," she said carefully, "about brand visual identity. I answered with honesty." Deborah looked at her for a moment with an expression that mixed concern and something that could be reluctant admiration. "Honesty," she repeated, as if it were a word that belonged to a language she knew but did not speak fluently. "Right. The agency director wants to talk to you at 11. The conversation with the director lasted 20 minutes and consisted, in essence, of many questions disguised as comments and a single explicit request that Camila act with discretion and not create expectations that the agency could not manage. What Dr. Alessandro wanted with her was an unknown to everyone, and unknowns in the corporate world were not welcome. Camila nodded to all this, with the serenity of someone who learned early that the first reflex of a system in the face of something unexpected is to try to contain it. Alessandro's contact arrived on the same day, in the afternoon. It was a simple message sent by the advisor. Dr. Alessandro would like an informal conversation about a project still in the conception phase. He asked if Camila would be available on Thursday afternoon at the Maison Velardi headquarters on Faria Lima. She said yes. The 3 days that separated Tuesday from the Thursday meeting were enough for something she had not yet noticed to take shape. It started with a photo. Someone at the event had taken an image of Camila sitting at the reserved table during dinner, while Alessandro leaned in slightly to hear what she was saying. The photo was technically good. It captured that instant in a way that, out of context, could be interpreted in various ways. Within the context of the event, it had been taken without either of them knowing. The photo appeared first on an anonymous profile, then in some messaging groups that circulated among people in the sector, then, in 2 days, in a fashion market gossip column that had tens of thousands of followers. The caption was not aggressive on the surface, but the insinuation was clear. Who was that unknown young woman sitting at Alessandro Velardi's reserved table, and how had she gotten there? The comments came fast. Some curious, others amused, many cruel with that particular cruelty that the internet cultivates when it finds someone who does not yet have a shield. They said she had calculated everything, that the story of the turned-over sign was too convenient, that certainly there was a reason why an intern had ended up dining with the most powerful man of the night, and that this reason had nothing to do with perspectives on communication design. Camila discovered the photo through a message from a college colleague who sent it with a "Did you see this?" at 11 at night on Wednesday. She stayed looking at the screen for a long time. There was something very specific in the type of pain that produced. It wasn't anger. It was something more like recognition. As if a voice she had heard her whole life, the voice that said she did not belong in certain places, had finally found a visual and public way to confirm itself. On Thursday morning, before leaving for the meeting on Faria Lima, she read the new messages. There was more. Someone had discovered her personal profile, and some comments had migrated there. Nothing illegal, nothing directly threatening, but the volume was enough for her to deactivate the comments and stay looking at the ceiling of her room for 10 minutes before being able to get up. She went anyway. By subway with the same bag, the same blazer, this time hers, simple and without any glamour. She thought about cancelling several times on the way. But there was something in giving up now, exactly when the pressure increased, that she could not accept. There was a whole life of cautious retreats embedded in this resistance, and she was tired of them. The Maison Velarde headquarters was a modern building on Faria Lima that combined tempered glass with exposed steel structures, the type of architecture that communicates prosperity without needing to shout. The lobby had the same white marble as the Grand Palacio Ibirapuera, the same type of elegant silence. The receptionist received her with impeccable courtesy and total efficiency. Alessandro's advisor picked her up 4 minutes later. Alessandro's office was on the 23rd floor and had a view of the city that, for a second, made Camilla completely forget why she was there. São Paulo, seen from above, had a quality she had never experienced so closely. That grey and alive immensity at the same time, a city that never seemed to be resting. Alessandro was standing when she entered, looking out the window. He turned with the same calm naturalness she had noticed at the gala. He greeted her with a brief and firm handshake and indicated a smaller side-meeting table which seemed destined for more informal conversations than those that happened at the main table. "You saw the photo," he said. It was not a question. Camilla stayed silent for an instant. "I did. And yet you came." "And yet I came," she said. He observed her for a moment, with that direct attention she had already learned was the way he processed things, without courtesy filters, without detours. Then he said, "I asked my communication team to do a survey on the origin of the photo and the accounts that started the circulation. We still don't have all the data." "You don't need to investigate this for me," she said. "I'm not doing it for you," he said, with an honesty she found surprisingly less cold than it would seem. "I'm doing it because what was done used images of my event to create a narrative that I will not tolerate." He paused. "But I want to know how you are." Camilla took a deep breath. "I'm okay, hurt in the way one becomes when something confirms a fear you already carried." She looked at the city through the window and then back at him. "There is a version of me that thought it was my paranoia, this feeling that certain places weren't made for me to be. The photo became proof that it wasn't paranoia." Alessandro stayed in silence for a moment. When he spoke, it was slowly. "I want to show you something before talking about the project." He stood up and went to the side bookshelf of the office. From a drawer, he took a thin folder and placed it on the table between them. Inside, there were hand sketches, quick, irregular strokes with notes in the margins in small, cursive handwriting. The old visual identity of Maison Velarde in its first original sketches. "These are my brother's drafts," he said. "From the beginning, when the company didn't have 10 employees and worked in an apartment in Bom Retiro." He looked at the papers. He wasn't trained in design. He was self-taught. But he had exactly what you described at that table, the ability to make people feel they belonged to something. Camilla looked at the sketches, and then she understood, with a clarity that few things that week had brought, why she was there. The project that Alessandro presented to Camilla that Thursday afternoon was simple in description and immense in ambition. Maison Velarde was developing a new line that would be launched in Brazil before international expansion, an accessible collection that would use the brand's luxury aesthetic values, but reach an audience that had never bought anything from the Maison, an audience that knew the brand from the shop window and not from the label. The problem was that none of the campaigns proposed by the advertising agency had managed to capture that voice with authenticity. All sounded like an expensive brand trying to look accessible, which was exactly the opposite of what they needed. "I want a perspective from someone who is on the other side of that shop window," said Alessandro, "not from someone who is simulating being on the other side." Camilla heard all this sitting at the side table of his office, with his brother's sketches still open between them, and São Paulo spread out on the other side of the glass. She understood the proposal. She also understood that there was something in it that transcended any normal corporate logic. The CEO of a large fashion company was asking an intern with 3 months of experience to help develop the voice of a campaign that his paid agencies had not managed to create. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you said in 2 minutes what 4 briefing meetings could not articulate," he said. And because you weren't trying to get it right, you were just saying what you saw. Camilla looked at the table. There was a part of her that wanted to accept without questioning, grab that opportunity with both hands before it evaporated. But there was another part, the part that had learned at a cost that entering without clarity into situations she did not yet understand created problems larger than staying outside, which needed more information before moving forward. "What are you proposing formally?" she asked. "A creative consultancy. Independent of your internship at the agency, at least in this initial phase, you work with me for 3 weeks, with access to the company's historical archive and the campaigns that are in development. At the end, you present a proposal for conceptual direction for the new line. And if the proposal doesn't serve, then I pay for your time and thank you for your contribution. And if it serves?" He looked at her in a way that was direct without being intimidating. "Then we talk about what comes after." There were few certainties available at that moment, but there was one. She could not make this decision without first talking to Deborah and the agency director, because accepting anything that interfered with her internship without warning would be a lack of transparency she was not willing to commit, regardless of any other consideration. She said that to Alessandro, exactly in that way, without beating around the bush, and she noticed that he listened to her with something that was close to approval. "Handle that and let me know by Monday," he said. Camilla left the Maison Velarde headquarters at 4 in the afternoon, entered the subway at Faria Lima station, and stood for the entire journey to Consolação, with the feeling that the ground under her feet had a different consistency. Not firmer, necessarily, but different. The weekend that followed was difficult for reasons that had nothing to do with Alessandro or Maison Velarde. The comments on social media had decreased in volume, but the narrative had consolidated in certain circles of the sector. In one of the stories that circulated, she had deliberately sat at the reserved table after researching the event floor plan to identify the best location. In another, she had used the registration confusion as a pretext to approach the main entrance of the hall. The stories were inconsistent with each other, but converged on a single conclusion, that she had calculated everything. What was behind those stories, she still did not know. What she knew was that someone had gone to the trouble of creating and distributing them, and that this someone had enough access to the event to know details that were not publicly available. On Monday morning, before calling Alessandro, she talked to Deborah. The coordinator listened to her without interrupting, asked 2 practical questions about the consultancy format, and then stayed in silence for a moment. "You know that this will generate comment in the agency," said Deborah finally. "I know. And do you really want to enter this project now, with everything that is going on social media?" Camilla thought about that question with honesty. If I back down now because someone is talking bad about me, I will be confirming the narrative that I don't deserve to be here. And that is worse than any comment they can make. Deborah stayed in silence for a few more seconds. Then she said with a lightness Camilla did not expect, "I never argued with an intern who had more clarity than I did about her own path. Go ahead." The agency director was more formal. He listed the conditions, that the consultancy be treated as a freelance project, outside internship hours, and that the agency be informed if Maison Velarde made any proposal for direct hiring. Camilla agreed to everything. It was reasonable. She called Alessandro's advisor at 10 in the morning. At 10:30, she had confirmation that the first work session would be the following Wednesday. They were 3 intense weeks. Camilla spent the mornings at the internship and the afternoons at the Maison Velarde headquarters, immersed in the company's historical archive, photographs of the first collections, Mateus Velarde's original sketches, records of old campaigns that had built the brand's identity before the search for internationalization exchanged heat for luster. Alessandro participated in the sessions when the agenda allowed, but there were days when it was just Camilla and the archive, she and those images of a past the company had decided to leave behind without knowing exactly what it was abandoning. On one of those days, while flipping through a photo album of a campaign from the first years of the Maison, she found an image that made her stop completely. It was a photo of 2 young men in a small atelier, surrounded by fabrics and mannequins. One of them was Alessandro, clearly younger, with a smile she had never seen on his face. The other was the brother, Mateusz, according to the handwritten caption on the back of the photo. They had the same trait in the eyes, the same posture, but completely distinct expressions. Alessandro serious, concentrated, Mateusz laughing with his head tilted slightly to one side. She stayed looking at that photo for a while, and then she understood something the archive data had not managed to communicate. The company had not lost its soul when it changed the logo. It had started to lose it much earlier when the man who had put his heart into it went away. That afternoon, Alessandro arrived earlier than expected. He found Camilla sitting with the photo in hand and stopped at the archive door for an instant before entering. "He would be angry with me," said Alessandro, sitting in the chair next to her, "for having let the company turn into this. Or he would be angry with whoever let you do everything alone," said Camilla. He did not answer immediately. He stayed looking at the photo for a moment and then placed it back in the album with a care that was almost the care of someone closing a wound. "You have 3 days for the final presentation," he said. "I do," she said. And there was something in both their voices, in that brief stretch of conversation in a silent archive, that had much less to do with brand campaigns than with all the other things that two human beings build when they stop pretending they are only talking about work. The presentation happened on a Friday morning, in a 10th floor meeting room of Maison Velarde, with windows facing Faria Lima. Alessandro had gathered 4 people besides himself: the marketing manager, the creative director, one of the minority partners, and Renata Voss, who entered the room 3 minutes late and sat at the opposite end of the table with a cordiality that filled the space without warming it. Camilla had prepared a 15-slide presentation. She did not start with the slides. She started by placing on the table the photos from the first Maison Velarde campaigns, the ones she had taken from the historical archive, next to the most recent campaigns. She said nothing in the first 30 seconds. She let the images speak before any word. "These 2 brands," she said finally, "are technically the same company. Same name, same history, same DNA. But they communicate completely distinct things. The one on the left says, 'I was made by someone who wanted to reach you.' The one on the right says, 'I was made by someone who learned to not need you.'" No one interrupted. "The new line that you want to launch cannot use the language of either of the 2. If it uses the current brand language, it will sound like a cheap version of an expensive thing. If it tries to imitate the original language without understanding where it came from, it will sound like manufactured nostalgia." She moved to the second slide. "It needs a third voice, a voice that is not looking up, trying to reach a standard, and is also not looking at the past, trying to recover something lost. It is looking at the people who were never included in this conversation and saying for the first time, 'This place was built with you in mind.'" The slides that followed were a combination of visual references, campaign concepts, and language guidelines that Camilla had developed over the 3 weeks. They were not the finished campaign. They were the direction. Tones of voice, chromatic choices, types of imagery, types of stories the line should tell. There were examples of international brands that had made similar transitions with success, analyzed in detail to understand what had worked and why. And there were, at the end, a series of references that came directly from Mateusz Velarde's original sketches, elements that were still latent in the brand's visual memory and that could be reactivated without being reproduced, as if the company were not copying its own past, but recognizing that there was something in it that should never have been left behind. When she finished, there was a silence of evaluation that Camilla learned to recognize during the weeks in the archive, the silence of people who are processing something that caught them slightly by surprise. The creative director was the first to speak. He asked 3 technical, specific questions, which she answered without hesitating. The marketing manager wanted to know about the data that grounded the audience choices. The minority partner asked about schedule and budget, which clearly was not the focus of that presentation, but Camilla answered with what she knew and was honest about what she did not know. Then Renata Voss raised her hand slightly, in a gesture that seemed polite, but had the weight of an objection already formulated before the meeting. "The proposal is creative and has merits," she said with that voice of velvet over stone that Camilla had already learned to recognize. "But I would need to question the basis of this analysis. The historical reading of the archive is interesting, but it was done by someone with 3 months of experience in the sector. It would be prudent to validate with the internal team before considering this as strategic direction." The room stayed silent for a second. Camilla looked at Renata and then looked at Alessandro, who was at the head of the table with an expression she could not completely read. "Renata," said Alessandro, with a calm that had more weight than any forcefulness, "can you tell me what was the last proposal from the internal team that managed to articulate exactly the problem that Camilla identified in 2 minutes at the gala?" Another pause, longer this time. "I am not saying that the proposal has no value," said Renata, recalibrating. "I am saying that a more robust validation process protects the company." "I agree that there is a process to go through," said Alessandro. "This is not the final product, it is a direction. What I am evaluating now is whether the direction makes sense, and it does." The meeting ended 30 minutes later with Alessandro thanking everyone and asking the marketing and creation teams to develop based on the presented proposal. Camilla left the room with the feeling that she had gone through something that was not just a work presentation, but she could not yet name exactly what it was. In the elevator hallway, Renata caught up with her. "For you did well," said Renata, in a tone that sounded like a compliment but had the texture of something different. "But a piece of advice from someone who has been in this market for 15 years. Be careful with what you interpret as genuine interest. The people here are very good at using others' enthusiasm for purposes that serve themselves first." Camilla looked at her for a moment. There were several answers available. The wisest, perhaps, was the shortest. "Thank you for the advice," she said. Renata entered the elevator. Camilla waited for the next one. The following day, Alessandro's advisor contacted her with a request. The CEO wanted an informal conversation before making any decision about the next steps. It wasn't a meeting, it wasn't a briefing. It was the type of conversation that happens outside agenda protocols on the office terrace at 6:30 in the evening, when the city had already changed its light. Camilla arrived punctually. Alessandro was standing by the parapet without a suit this time, just a long-sleeved shirt with the sleeves rolled up to the elbow, looking at São Paulo, which was lighting up gradually in the beginning of the night. They stayed in silence for a moment after she arrived. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the type of silence that happens when 2 human beings have already established enough of a code not to need to fill the air constantly. "Renata told me that she will evaluate the proposal more judiciously before approving any development," said Alessandro. "She warned me too in her own way." He looked at her. "What do you think of her?" Camilla thought about the question with honesty. "I think she is very good at what she does. And I think my presence here bothers something that has nothing to do with me specifically. It has to do with what my presence represents." Alessandro stayed in silence for a moment. What does it represent? That the most useful knowledge sometimes doesn't come from where you expected. That is a threat to whoever built authority based on being the source of that knowledge. He made a low sound that could have been agreement or something closer to silent admiration. Then he said, looking again at the city, "My brother used to say something I never forgot. He said that most of a company's problems are not strategy problems. They are courage problems. The strategy is usually there, visible if someone has the courage to point it out." Camilla looked at the jagged horizon of São Paulo, that irregular line of concrete and glass that was at the same time chaotic and indisputably alive. "He must have been a difficult person to replace," she said in a low voice. Alessandro did not answer immediately. When he spoke, the voice had a different texture from the other times. "Impossible," he said, "but not for lack of trying." And there it was. That sentence that came out before he decided to let it out, carrying more than any briefing, more than any meeting, more than any campaign proposal. The evidence that there was a man underneath the CEO, and that this man had been, for a long time, very lonely. The following week began with a phone call that Camilla did not expect. It was from the Human Resources Directorship of Maison Velarde, not the sector that had been her point of contact in the last weeks. A formal and careful voice informed her that there was an internal investigation underway related to the gala event and that a conversation would be necessary to clarify some points about her presence at the reserved table that night. Camilla asked them to repeat the information. They repeated. She said she would be available to talk. She scheduled the meeting for Tuesday morning. When she hung up the phone, she sat on the edge of the bed in her apartment in Saumarez for a long moment. There was something in that call that had a painful familiarity, the feeling that the narrative had arrived before her at a place that should be neutral. Before any conversation, before any investigation, the framing was already established. It wasn't a meeting to understand what had happened. It was a meeting to confirm what had already been decided had happened. She did not call Alessandro. She thought about it, decided it would not be correct, and did not call. The Tuesday meeting was in the 20th floor Human Resources room. There were two representatives of the sector, a woman in her mid-40s named Joanna, who conducted with professional neutrality, and a younger man who took notes without commenting. The tone was of administrative investigation, not of direct accusation, but the content of the questions had a clear direction. How Camilla had reached that table, who had authorized her stay there, was there personal interest on her part in approaching the company's leadership? Camilla answered each question with precision and calm. She described the registration confusion, the turned-over sign, the fact that Alessandro had asked her to stay. She said that it had been he who initiated the conversation, that it had been he who invited her to dinner, that any implication that she had maneuvered that situation was factually incorrect. Joanna listened to everything, made some notes, and then said with a cordiality that functioned as distance, "We understand. The issue is that the behavior was perceived as inappropriate by some people present at the event, and our internal policy requires that we investigate situations that generate discomfort among collaborators and partners." "Which collaborators?" asked Camilla. There was a pause. "I cannot reveal names at this stage of the investigation." Camilla asked a single additional question. If the investigation had considered hearing Alessandro Velarde himself, who was directly involved in the situation, Joanna said the process followed its protocols. Camilla nodded and said she remained at their disposal for any additional clarification. She left the room with an uncomfortable but necessary clarity. Someone had triggered that process. Someone with enough access to the internal structure to start an HR investigation from an external event, and with enough motivation to do it. She went to the agency. She worked all day with the forced concentration of someone who decides they will not let the external noise contaminate the work. At 4 in the afternoon, while reviewing registration material for an event the following week, she received a message from Alessandro through the channel the advisor had established for the consultancy. "I need to talk to you. Today, if possible." She answered yes. They met on the same terrace as the previous time, this time with São Paulo covered by a heavy late-afternoon sky that promised rain. Alessandro was not calm in the same way as the other times. There was a contained tension in him, the type that does not overflow, but that is perceptible to whoever has learned to read what is underneath the posture. "I was informed about the HR meeting," he said. "Not by the HR team, through an indirect channel." "So you didn't know before?" asked Camilla. "No." The voice had a quality she had not heard in him before, something close to anger but colder than anger. "The process was initiated without my knowledge, and there is a name involved that I was expecting to find." Camilla did not ask the name. There was a part of her that already knew, or at least suspected, and there was an important difference between suspecting and confirming that she did not want to cross at that moment. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Alessandro stayed in silence for an instant. "First, I want to know how you are." She thought about that question with honesty, as she had learned to do in the last weeks. "I am angry, but the anger is healthy. What worries me more is the exhaustion that appears after the anger, that voice that starts to say that maybe it's not worth the effort." She looked at him. "I've known that voice for a long time. It lies, but it's convincing when you're tired." Alessandro looked at her with that total attention she had noticed since the first night. "Are you going to resign?" he asked. The question caught Camilla by surprise, not because of the question itself, but because of the directness with which it was asked, as if he knew that that was the next station on the path she was traveling. And it was. She had thought about it the night before. She had thought that it would be simpler, more dignified perhaps, just to leave before the investigation process reached some conclusion they would use to justify the termination of the internship. Leaving on her own terms kept the narrative under control. Leaving on her own terms was an act of preservation. "I am considering it," she said. "I needed you not to do that," said Alessandro. There was something in that sentence she did not expect. It wasn't a request. It was almost a confession. "Why not?" she asked in a low voice. He stayed in silence for a moment that seemed longer than it was, and then he said something that had many more layers than the surface could indicate. "Because in the last 3 weeks, for the first time in a long time, I have returned to believing that this company can be what it should be. And that didn't happen because of any consultant, any agency, any internal process. It happened because of a way of seeing that you carry, and that one doesn't learn in an academy. And I am not willing to let the fear of someone who feels threatened push that away from here." The rain began to fall slowly, that thin São Paulo rain that precedes a storm. Neither of them moved. "Is this about the company?" asked Camilla after a moment. He took time to answer, and when he answered, it was with an honesty that seemed to cost something. "Not only." The terrace stayed in silence. The city continued beneath them, indifferent and alive. That specific mixture of urgency and chaos that São Paulo exhibited to everyone, without distinction of internship or position. And in that silence, something established itself between them that did not need words to be real, but which also did not yet have a name, and of which both, each in their own way, were aware that whatever came next would be different from everything that had come before. The storm that had threatened São Paulo that terrace afternoon arrived for real the following Thursday. The rain started before dawn and did not stop. The city woke up with overflowing rivers and red traffic notifications in the center. Camilla left home at 7 in the morning anyway. She had decided the night before that she would not resign. Not for Alessandro, not for any external reason, because the fear that pushed her to the exit was exactly the same fear that had limited her every step in the last years, and she had decided it was time to stop using it as a compass. What she did not know yet was that Thursday held something that would change the angle of that whole story in a way she had not predicted. The official photographer of the Gala Velarde was named René Aquino. She had noticed him on the night of the event, a tall man in his 50s with professional cameras and the specific discretion of someone who learned to be invisible to capture the visible. What she did not know is that René and she had a connection that came from before. He had photographed her college graduation exhibition 2 years earlier and had praised one of the panels she had developed for the project. They exchanged contact at that time and lost each other afterward, as usually happens. René got in touch by message that Thursday at 8 in the morning. "Camilla, we need to talk. I have something you need to see." They met at a coffee shop on Augusta Street at 10. René arrived with a tablet and a folder of printed images. He sat in the chair in front of her with the expression of someone who is about to say something important and wants to be sure they are doing it right before saying it. "I've been following what's coming out about you on social media since the gala," he said, "and I have something that directly contradicts the narrative that is being built." He turned the tablet toward her. It was a sequence of photos, not the ones that had circulated on social media, the ones that showed the two of them sitting together during dinner. It was another series, from before, long before the reserved table, images captured during the event setup phase, when René had arrived earlier to document the space before the guests. And there was Alessandro Velarde. In the photos, he was standing near the hall entrance, clearly arriving earlier than the normal protocol required. In one of the images, he was looking toward the registration table. In another, even more revealing, there was a view of the hall from the angle where he was, and in the background of the image, visible but small, was Camilla, organizing the badges, with the oversized grey blazer folded at the sleeves. He had seen her before, long before she sat at the reserved table. "There's more," said René. He moved to the following images. There was the sequence that Camilla had not imagined existed, Alessandro moving through the hall in the minutes before the table incident. And in each of the photos, in different angles, in distinct moments, Camilla was in the frame. Not in the center, but there. René had photographed the hall, but Alessandro had followed Camilla with his gaze through the entire sequence. In the last image of the series, Alessandro was standing near the plant partition that surrounded the reserved table, and Camilla was sitting there, without knowing that he was observing her. The sign had fallen. She had sat. But he was already close. Camilla stayed looking at the images for a long time without saying anything. He wasn't tolerating an accidental situation, said René carefully. He chose that moment. The revelation hit Camilla in a way she had not predicted. Not as a romantic surprise, but as a reconfiguration of the entire sense of that night. That encounter had not been chance, not in the sense that he had planned something, but in the sense that there was something in motion before any word was said. She had entered the hall and caught the attention of someone who was used to seeing without being seen. Not for her appearance or for her position, but for some quality she did not even know she carried. René printed the complete series of images and placed the envelope on the table between them. "You need to decide what you do with this," he said. She left the coffee shop with the envelope under her arm and the rain still falling. She walked along Augusta Street aimlessly for a few minutes, letting the thin rain wet her coat. And then she called Alessandro. "I need to show you something," she said when he answered. They met at the Maison Velarde headquarters an hour later. She placed the photos on his office table in sequence, without commenting. She let him see them alone first. Alessandro stayed looking at the images for a long time. When he raised his eyes, there was something in them she had not seen before. It wasn't shame, it wasn't surprise. It was something more like recognition of himself, being seen from an angle he did not know. "I hadn't realized I was doing that so evidently," he said. "That's not what matters," said Camilla. "What matters is that this contradicts the whole narrative. I didn't approach you. You were paying attention to me before anything happened." He stayed in silence for a moment, and then he said something she did not expect. "Do you want to know why?" She had not asked, but she said yes. "You were organizing the badges when I arrived at the hall. Alone at a table that everyone passed without looking. There was something in the way you handled the papers, with a concentration that wasn't performing for anyone. In a room full of people who were all somehow being characters of themselves, you were the only one who seemed to just exist." He paused. Mateus was like that. In a room full of people doing what they thought they should do, he simply was there. And that was more magnetic than any effort. Camilla took a moment to answer. And when she spoke, the voice came out with a firmness she herself noticed, the type that doesn't come from borrowed courage, but from something that finally settled in the right place. "I need you to do something," she said. "What?" "I need you to say publicly what happened that night. Not to defend me. To end a narrative that is being fed by someone who has an interest in it continuing." Alessandro looked at her. Then he looked at the photos on the table. And then, for the first time since she had known him, he smiled for real. Not the controlled smile of the meetings, not the calculated courtesy of the galas, but the type of smile that appears when a human being decides they will no longer pretend that things are more complicated than they are. "I'm going to do better than that," he said. And that was what he did. On Friday morning, Alessandro Velarde called a press conference at the Maison Velarde headquarters. It was not announced in advance, which in itself was already outside the company's normal protocol. When the journalists arrived, they expected a note about the expansion to Europe or about the new collection. What they found was Alessandro standing in front of the room without a teleprompter and without advisors 2 steps away. Just him and the microphone. He spoke for 23 minutes. He said the company had gone through a gradual process of distancing from the values that had founded it. He said that this had happened with his direct participation, through decisions that privileged posture over substance. He said that a young woman named Camilla Fonseca had entered a gala of his by accident, sat at a reserved table due to a knocked-over sign, and said in 2 minutes what years of paid consultancies had not managed to articulate, that the company had lost its humanity in the process of gaining prestige. Then he talked about the photos. He presented the sequence that René had captured. He said that the narrative that had circulated about Camilla was factually false, that she had not calculated anything, that she had been observed and then found, not the other way around, and that the attempt to destroy her reputation had come from an internal interest that he had identified, and that would result in administrative consequences within the company. He did not say Renata Voss's name, but the journalists present knew the Maison Velarde organizational chart well, and the silence around a name that was not said can be as eloquent as what is said. And he announced that he had offered the position to Camilla Fonseca, who had accepted. The hall stayed silent for a second, then came the questions. Alessandro answered each one with the same calm as always, but there was something different in that calm now. It was no longer the calm of someone who protects themselves, it was the calm of someone who decided to stop protecting themselves. On the other side of the city, Camilla was in an apartment in Sumare, listening to everything on her cell phone, with the volume high enough to fill the room. When Alessandro pronounced her name into the microphone, she was sitting on the edge of the window with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, looking at the wet street below. She had entered a gala hall as an intern, sat at a reserved table by mistake, said things that no one had asked her to say, and now her name was being pronounced into a microphone in front of the Brazilian fashion sector press. There was a direct line between that turned-over sign and this moment. And that line was not luck. It was the sum of everything she had carried and cultivated over years in which the world had tried, in varied and persistent ways, to convince her that belonging to certain places required apologizing for existing. She had not apologized. And there she was. 3 months later, Maison Velarde launched the new line at the Museum of Modern Art in São Paulo. It was not a gala, it was an open party, with free tickets for the general public, live music from artists of the city, food served on long tables without reserved seats, and lighting that chose warmth instead of spectacle. The press present was a mixture of fashion journalists, niche influencers, neighborhood bloggers, and ordinary people who had signed up through the website. It was deliberately the type of event the Maison had never done before. The campaign for the new line was presented on a huge panel on the main museum wall. Images of ordinary people wearing the pieces in ordinary contexts, a seamstress from Muka, a teacher from Lapa, a design student from Jabaquara, a grandmother from Brass. The photos did not have excessive retouching. The settings were not studios. There was imperfection in all of them, in a way that was not carelessness, it was intention. The mark of someone who knows that true luxury is not perfection, but authenticity. In the center of the panel, a phrase in clean typography developed from the original sketches of Mateus Velarde, whose cursive handwriting had been digitized and integrated into the new visual identity of the collection. This place was built with you in mind. Camilla was standing at the side of the hall when Alessandro approached. She had spent the last weeks coordinating every detail of that night with a team that had learned, fast, that the new director of identity and belonging was not decorative. She was a person who asked difficult questions in meetings, who sent back any proposal that sounded like luxury pretending to be accessible, and who had a specific capacity to identify the exact moment in which an idea had lost its honesty. "Did it turn out as you imagined?" asked Alessandro. She looked at the hall, the people circulating without that gala event rigidity, conversations that mixed accents and references, a young woman in sneakers and natural hair photographing the panel with her cell phone, and then looking at the image with an expression Camilla recognized, because it had been her expression for years, the expression of someone trying to understand if that was really talking to her. "It turned out better," said Camilla. Alessandro stayed beside her for a moment, looking at the same point. There was something in the way the two of them existed in the same space that had changed since the terrace in the rain, since the press conference, since the conversations in the archive. It was no longer the relationship of CEO and consultant, although it was also that. It was something that had been built at the intersection of two stories that met by accident, or by something that seemed like accident, until all the pieces were visible. "I want to show you something," he said. They went to a side room of the museum, where the team had set up a brand memory space. Historical photos, first sketches, letters, objects from the original atelier in Bom Retiro. In the center of the table, under glass, was the original plaque of the identity created by Matteus Velarde. And beside it, in a simple frame, was the photo that René had taken on that gala night. Alessandro standing in the hall, his gaze in the background of the frame, where Camilla, small and concentrated, organized the badges without knowing she was being observed. Alessandro had asked René for the photo, and he had chosen to place it there in that memory space, among the things the company had decided not to forget. "Why this one?" asked Camilla in a low voice. "Because it's the moment before everything changes," he said. "And I want to remember how what matters appears, without warning, without ceremony, at a registration table at a gala event, in someone who wasn't trying to be found." Camilla stayed looking at the photo for a moment, at that image of her that did not know she was being seen, with the oversized blazer and the clipboard in hand, and all that concentration of someone who was trained by life to exist with discretion. "I never thought I would be remembered like this," she said. "How?" "As someone who was just being." Alessandro looked at her, and there was something in that look that had traveled through weeks, conversations, silences, terraces with rain, historical archives and press conferences to arrive there, something that no longer had any layer of protocol between itself and what it was. "It is the only way real things begin," he said. Later, when the event was at its peak of movement, when the museum was full and the campaign had been published on social media, with Alessandro's full text explaining the philosophy behind the new line, when the comments were already starting to arrive in volume, and most of them spoke of recognition, of seeing oneself represented in a place where they never expected to see themselves, Camilla went out for a moment to the museum's outdoor area. São Paulo was clear that night, one of those rare moments when the city decides to be generous with the stars and the light. She stood at the edge of the garden with a glass of water in hand, listening to the noise of the party inside and the noise of the city around, that overlap of sounds that was the sonic signature of the largest city in Brazil. She had sat at a reserved table by mistake. She had said things she was not authorized to say. She had stayed when she should have left. She had resisted when it would have been easier to yield. And in the process, she had found a job that made sense, a company that was becoming what it should be, and a man who had learned the difference between being in a hall full of people and not being alone. Sometimes what seems like a mistake is just the world putting you exactly where you needed to be. The difference between the two is the courage to not apologize for having arrived. And if you've come this far, carrying this story from beginning to end, it's because there's something in this narrative that touched something real. Maybe you've also sat in a place that wasn't yours and waited for someone to send you away. Maybe you also know that voice that says certain dreams weren't made for people like you. This story exists to say that that voice lies. Always. If this story moves something in you, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell in the comments what was the moment that touched you the most. There are new stories arriving every week, stories of people who chose to stay when the easiest thing would be to leave, who said what needed to be said when silence would be more comfortable, who found belonging in places that seemed forbidden. Each story is a mirror. Each story is an invitation. Click to subscribe and come with us. The next story is already waiting for you. End of story.